Montana Territory, April 1883. The snow had barely melted off the ridges when they called her a liar. Keziah Barnes stood at the front of the church with both hands wrapped tight around her belly, chin lifted, voice steady even though her heart hammered in her chest. His name is Weston North. He is the father. Gasps rippled through the pews, heads turned, eyes narrowed. Some women clutched their children closer as if her words would infect them. The preacher's mouth twisted, and from somewhere near the back a man barked out a bitter laugh. "Weston North's been gone near a year," someone muttered. "She made it up," said another. "Trying to trap a name to her shame." Keziah didn't argue. She just stood there with her back straight and her eyes dry, though inside everything screamed. She had not asked for this, had not asked for the baby growing inside her, had not asked to be abandoned, and certainly had not asked to fall in love with a cowboy who disappeared after 4 nights of shared firelight and whispered plans. The townsfolk filed out in silence, leaving her alone in front of the pulpit, the preacher avoiding her eyes. No one said a word to her, not even goodbye. She walked home alone, the wind blowing through her shawl, knocking her hair loose. Her little cabin sat 2 miles west of town, tucked against the edge of the pine woods. Her father had built it before he passed. Now it belonged to her, and soon to her child. She lit a fire, boiled water, and sat at the table holding the baby's socks she had knitted. She had not seen Weston since last summer. He was a trail rider headed north with a cattle drive, sweet-talking, gentle-eyed, the only man who had looked at her like she mattered. He had promised to come back by winter, but winter had come and gone, and still, she hoped, 3 days passed. Then 5. The town whispered, but no one helped. She went to the store and the owner looked through her like she wasn't there. Even the schoolteacher crossed the street to avoid her. On the 7th day, Keziah heard hoofbeats outside her cabin. She stood slowly, heart pounding, and opened the door. There he was. Weston North sat atop a dust-covered buckskin mare, his hat in his hand, eyes locked on her like he had never left. His jaw was rough with travel, his coat worn through at the sleeves, but the moment he saw her belly, he slid off the horse like his legs barely held him. "Keziah," he said, voice hoarse. She stared at him, her throat thick. "You said you would come back." "I tried. I got thrown from a horse 2 days out of town, broke my ribs and damn near died, took weeks before I could ride again. I came as fast as I could." She swallowed hard. "They all said I lied." He stepped forward. "Did you?" "No," he nodded once. Then he turned toward the town, his voice loud and sure. "She's telling the truth," he shouted. "And I'm him. I'm the father," her breath caught. He turned back and looked at her with something raw and certain in his eyes. "I never stopped thinking about you, about us." She backed up and let him inside. The cabin was warm, the fire crackling. He took off his coat and sat at the table across from her, his hands shaking. "Boy or girl?" he asked. "I do not know yet." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I want to be here. I want to raise this child with you." Her voice barely made it out. "Why now?" "Because I never stopped loving you, because I never meant to leave you alone. Because if you will have me, I want to marry you." Keziah stared at him, searching his face for anything false. She found nothing but truth. "I still love you, Weston," she whispered. He stood and came around the table, kneeling beside her, pressing his forehead to her belly. "I will make it right," he said. "I swear it." And for the first time in months, Keziah believed someone. That night they sat by the fire, their hands entwined. Weston had brought supplies, money from his work, and a plan. He would build them a home stronger than this one, closer to the river. He would make a life with her, honest and proud. Keziah leaned her head against his shoulder. "They will still talk." "Let them," he said. "We know the truth." She smiled then, slow and quiet. Outside, the wind carried snowmelt down from the mountains. Inside, something warmer blossomed between them. She was not alone anymore. He was back, and he was hers. Morning sun slanted through the window panes, catching in the folds of the homespun curtains. Keziah sat on the porch steps, her apron damp where she'd wiped her hands, watching Weston split a log with one clean stroke. He'd risen before first light, moving quiet so as not to wake her, and walked down to the creek. Now his shirt clung to his back, sweat marking the collar, sawdust clinging to his trousers. She rested her hand lightly on her side. The baby had shifted lower last night. The ache in her back said it wouldn't be long now. You always work like that?" she asked, voice soft in the stillness. He paused, pushing his hat back with the crook of his arm. "Work keeps a man honest, leastways that's what my uncle used to say. Did he raise you?" "No, raised myself mostly. He just gave me a place to sleep when cattle weren't moving." "He wasn't a kind man." Weston's mouth tightened and he reached for another log. She stood slowly and stepped down to meet him, the earth soft beneath her shoes. "You don't have to talk about him." "I want to." He glanced at her, then down at his hands. "He taught me how to sit a saddle and how to fight back when someone tried to take something from me. That's about all." Keziah said nothing for a long moment. Then she reached out and touched his wrist, her fingers light. "You don't have to fight here." His shoulders eased just slightly. "I know." They walked back to the cabin together, the air warming as the morning stretched on. Weston carried the chopped wood in a split basket, setting it down just inside the door. Keziah moved to the stove, laying a skillet over the heat. She cracked eggs into the pan, their sizzle the only sound for a while. "Do you want to choose a name?" she asked over her shoulder. He looked up from where he was brushing ash from his trousers. "I've been thinking about that." She slid a plate toward him, eggs and a slice of the cornbread she'd baked the night before. "Me too." "Would you hate it if it was after my mother?" He met her eyes. "Her name was Ada." Keziah smiled faintly. "No. I think that would be kind. If it's a boy, I thought maybe Thomas. That was your father's name, wasn't it?" Her hand stilled on the edge of the table. "Yes, it was. I want this baby to feel like it belongs to both of us, not just in name." Keziah sat down across from him, folding her hands. "That's what I want too." They ate in silence for a while, the fire snapping softly behind them. Outside, a hawk circled high over the hills. Weston turned his fork over in his hand. "I went into town yesterday after you fell asleep." She looked up sharply. "Why?" "I needed to speak to the preacher. Asked him to marry us." Her breath caught just once. "What did he say?" "He said if we show up Sunday morning, he'll do it. No questions." She stared at the table for a long time before speaking. "You're sure?" He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I've never been more certain of anything." Heat touched her throat, but she didn't pull away. "I don't have a white dress." "I don't want a dress." "I want you." The quiet that followed was not empty, it was full of something solid, something true. She looked at the man across from her and saw not the trail rider who'd passed through, but someone who had stayed, who had chosen her. She rose to gather the dishes, and he joined her at the basin. Their shoulders brushed as they worked. He dried while she rinsed. Their hands found each other once under the water, and neither let go right away. That afternoon, Weston returned from the woods with 4 long cedar boards and an old horseshoe he'd found nailed to a fence post. He carved the boards slowly, each stroke deliberate, and nailed them together into a cradle. The horseshoe he worked into the rail for luck. Keziah watched from the doorway, her hand resting low again. The baby shifted once more, slower now, like it was listening. "You ever built one of those before?" she asked. He didn't look up. "No, but I've spent years sleeping under the stars. I figured I could make something better than dirt for my child." She stepped out into the yard and knelt beside the cradle. "It's perfect." That night they didn't sit apart. By the fire, she leaned into him, her head resting beneath his jaw. He wrapped his arm around her, fingers splayed over the curve of her side. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The stars came out in quiet procession. The wind shifted, carrying the first scent of pine bloom. And inside the cabin, 2 people who had been strangers not long ago sat close, hearts steady, the future finally drawing breath. The creek near the new clearing ran fast and clear, swollen with meltwater that carried bits of pine needles and broken twigs downstream. Weston stood calf-deep in its chill, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hauling stones from the bed to build a foundation for what would be their new home. The land sloped gentle to the south, sunlight catching on the tall grass where deer sometimes wandered through at dawn. Keziah stayed nearby on a wool blanket, a basket of sewing in her lap. Her feet were bare in the grass, ankles swelling more with each passing day. She threaded her needle slowly, eyes drifting often to where Weston worked. She didn't speak until he came out of the water with a flat river stone and knelt to set it carefully in place. "You always build like it's something sacred," she said. He pressed the stone into the earth, adjusting it with care. It is. How so? I never had anything that stayed put long enough to call it mine. This is the ground I'll grow old on. That makes it worth getting right. She lowered her sewing. And if the baby comes before those walls are up, I'll lay a roof over the frame if I have to. You'll have a place dry and warm even if I have to sleep outside. You're not sleeping outside. He looked up, and his mouth pulled into something quiet and sure. Then I'd better work faster. By evening, the first row of stones circled the plot, and Weston's hands were scraped raw across the knuckles. Keziah walked with him back to the cabin, her arm looped through his. They moved slow, the way people do when they're listening to the land settle around them. Inside, the fire burned low. She ladled stew into bowls while he cleaned his hands at the basin. He winced as the water hit the scrapes. "Let me look," she said, setting the ladle aside. He sat at the table while she dabbed his knuckles with a cloth dipped in warm water. She didn't speak, but her fingers moved gentle, steady. When she finished, she laid his hand flat between both of hers. "I heard from Mrs. Tolliver," she said. He stilled. "What for?" "She brought me a bundle of cloth for the baby, said she was sorry for the way things went." He studied her face. "You believe her?" "I believe people never like being wrong, but sometimes when they are, they try to fix it the only way they know how." He was quiet a moment. "Then you want me to take you into town? I think I want to walk in with you on Sunday. Together," he nodded once. "We will." That night, lightning blinked far off in the mountains, the kind that stays behind the clouds and never speaks. Keziah lay on her side, one hand braced beneath her belly, the other resting on Weston's chest. He hadn't spoken in some time, but his breathing was slow and even. "I don't have a ring," he said suddenly, voice low. She kept her eyes closed. "I don't need one, I know. But I still want to give you something." She shifted closer, her cheek against his shoulder. "Then give me a life where I don't have to be afraid." His arm came around her, pulling her in, and his voice broke against her hair. "I swear I will." Outside, the wind moved through the pines like a hush. The cradle by the hearth waited, empty still, but the cabin no longer felt unfinished. It felt like the beginning of something built to last. The church bell tolled once, low and slow, as Weston tied the mare to the post out front. He offered Keziah his arm, and she took it with a steadiness that surprised even her. The hem of her dress brushed the spring dust, and though her boots pinched from swelling, she held her head high. A few women stood near the steps, their mouths half open like they meant to speak but forgot what kindness sounded like. Keziah didn't look away, and Weston didn't slow his steps. They passed through the doors together. Inside, the pews were half filled. Mr. Crane, who ran the dry goods store, nodded once. Clara Samuels looked at Keziah's stomach, then back to Weston, her brows knitting into something unreadable. No one whispered this time. No one laughed. The preacher waited at the front, eyes resting thoughtfully on the pair as they approached. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer a sermon. He simply opened his worn book and said, "Are you ready?" Weston's voice didn't tremble. "Yes, sir." Keziah met his eyes. "I am." When the vows were spoken, Weston reached into his coat and pulled out a pale blue ribbon. Frayed on one end, it looked like it might have once belonged to something finer. He tied it gently around her ring finger. "It belonged to my sister," he said, barely above a whisper. "She passed when she was small. Mama kept it in her Bible. I reckon she'd want you to have it." Keziah curled her fingers around the knot. "Then I'll keep it safe." Afterward, they didn't linger. They stepped into the sunlight as man and wife, the breeze lifting the ribbon at her hand. No one followed them out. No one needed to. They walked home without speaking much, the kind of silence that didn't press, just rested easy between them. When they reached the cabin, Weston hung his hat on the peg and turned to her. "Do you want to lie down a while?" Her hands settled on her sides. "I think I want to sit on the porch and feel the air." He nodded and followed her out, bringing the chair he'd built from pine slats and setting it beside hers. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and damp earth, and somewhere far off, the crows were calling across the meadow. "I don't remember my mother," Keziah said after a long while, "just that her hands were warm." Weston shifted slightly, not to speak, but to listen better. "After she died, folks stopped coming around. It was like we were something contagious. Pa tried to keep things together, but it wore him down. I guess I learned not to expect people to stay. I ain't going anywhere, Weston said. She didn't answer right away. Then, you already didn't. The light softened across the fields, drawing long shadows from the fence posts. Weston stood and went inside, returning with a small square wrapped in burlap. He placed it in her lap. She untied the twine and lifted the cloth. Inside was a folded baby blanket, hand-stitched, the edges uneven but careful. I made it last week, he said. Didn't know if the stitches would hold, but I figured it'd keep a little one warm. She ran her thumb over the rough thread. Why didn't you give it to me sooner? I was waiting for the right day. Her throat tightened, but she didn't cry. She leaned into his shoulder, and they sat like that until night crept in. Later, when the fire inside the cabin had burned low and the moon carved silver lines across the floor, Keziah stirred in her sleep. A sharp pain laced across her back, then settled deep in her belly. She waited through the first one, hand gripping the edge of the mattress, breath held. When the second came, she nudged Weston awake. His eyes opened slow, but when he saw her face, he was on his feet at once. Is it time? She nodded once, jaw tight. I think so. He lit the lamp and moved quickly, fetching water, unrolling the linens they'd set aside weeks ago. His hands weren't as steady as they'd been building the cradle, but they didn't falter. I'll be right here, he said, kneeling beside her. She met his gaze, sweat already gathering at her brow. I know. Outside, the wind died down. The night went quiet, as if the world was holding its breath, and within those cabin walls something new began. The first cry came just before dawn, high and thin, and Weston's hands trembled where they gripped the edge of the basin. He looked to Keziah, her face pale and damp with sweat, her lips parted in relief more than pain. The midwife, called from the edge of the neighboring settlement, wrapped the child in the cotton flannel Keziah had laid out weeks ago and placed the baby in her arms. Keziah stared down at the small, red face blinking up at her. A girl, she whispered, voice hoarse. Weston stepped closer, his boots soundless on the floorboards. She's here, he said, not believing it until he saw her fingers curl around Keziah's shift. The midwife nodded, tucking her satchel closed. Strong lungs, you'll both do fine now. Keziah looked up. Thank you for coming. I was glad to. Word carries, and not all of it's cruel. The woman paused, then added, Some of us remember your father. He helped folk when no one else would. When the midwife left, closing the door soft behind her, Weston sank to the floor beside the bed. He rested his forehead against Keziah's knee, his breath unsteady. She looks like you, he said after a long minute. I think she has your chin, Keziah answered, voice steadier now, and your ears. He laughed under his breath and looked up at her. I was scared, Kez. I know. So was I. He reached up and tucked a damp curl behind her ear. I didn't know I could feel this much and not come apart. You're not coming apart. You're here. They named her Ada as they'd planned and wrapped her in the blanket Weston had stitched himself. She slept in the cradle warmed by the fire, her breath soft, and even in the days that followed, neighbors came in ones and twos. A pie left on the stoop, a set of diapers sewn from flour sacks. Clara Samuels came with a tin of salve and stayed long enough to hold the baby, her face unreadable until she finally said, She'll grow up strong, same as her mother. Weston repaired the porch rail with pine from the ridge just east of the clearing. He added a second chair beside Keziah's and sanded them both smooth so the slats wouldn't catch on her skirts. Each evening they sat with Ada between them, her fingers curled around the edge of her wool bonnet. One morning, Keziah held the child against her shoulder and watched Weston hammer the final shingle onto the roof of the new house. The frame stood near the creek where the grass grew thick and green, the windows cut wide to catch light from every end of the day. You should come see, he called down, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. It's ready. She climbed the low hill with Ada in her arms and stepped inside the doorway. The cedar walls still smelled fresh, the floor swept clean. A quilt hung from the loft rail, a gift from Clara, left without a note. The hearthstone was the one Weston had chosen from the creek, round and dark with a pale vein of quartz running through it. It feels like it's already ours, she said. It is. He took Ada from her and laid her gently in the basket at the foot of their bed. The child stirred once, then settled. Weston turned and reached for Keziah's hand. "I never thought I'd have this," he said. "A place, a family, you have it now." He cupped her face in both hands, the calluses rough but his touch careful. "I love you, Keziah." She leaned into him, her voice low against his chest. "I've loved you longer than I had any right to." They stood like that as dusk settled over the new home. The fire in the hearth caught, throwing gold across the walls. Outside, the first stars blinked into view. And inside, two people who had once lived by silence and distance now lived by warmth and presence. Years passed, and the land held firm. Weston planted apple trees near the porch, and Keziah taught Ada how to read with her fingers tracing each word. They opened their door to those who needed a meal or a quiet place to sit, and no one ever left without being offered both. Weston's hair silvered at the edges. Keziah's hands grew lined and sure. Ada grew tall, her laughter like wind in the trees. In autumns, they pressed cider from the orchard and passed mugs between them as they sat by the fire. In winters, Weston carved toys from cedar scraps, and Keziah stitched shawls with Ada curled against her side. They never left that land. They never needed to. And in every season, no matter the wind or the weight of the day, they came back to each other. Always together.